thank you all for being here today. We are honored to have as our guest today the Honorable Robert O'Brien. And the topic that we're going to be discussing is about winning the 5G revolution. But I dare say we'll probably create some extra time to talk about some things that are happening in other parts of the world right now. Our friend Scooter Libby has promised that if we don't bring it up, that he'll with regard to that. So we'll be prepared for that. Our guest served as the President's principal advisor on all aspects of American foreign policy and national security affairs as National Security Advisor, the 28th one from 2019 to 2021. And he is co-founder and chairman of American Global Strategies. As National Security Advisor, Ambassador O'Brien brought a very welcome, renewed focus on defense and industrial base issues. A longtime advocate of sea power and a 355-ship Navy. Ambassador O'Brien visited leading shipyards during his tenure, also spent time at defense plants and with our troops at bases around the world. He also, as National Security Advisor, had the good sense to appoint yours truly as a senior advisor, where we had a chance to work together on a number of projects, including projects related to 5G, which is one of the things that we want to talk about is our efforts there to sort of get America up and moving in the 5G sector. During his time as National Security Advisor, the United States orchestrated the historic Abraham Accords in the Middle East. That would be another great topic to discuss at some point, is Middle East policy and where the last administration was and where the present administration needs to go. He brokered economic normalization between Serbia and Kosovo, overcoming those long-standing rivalries and antagonisms between those two countries. He achieved significant defense spending increases among our NATO allies, who I notice now are beginning to think maybe just getting up to 2% maybe not enough, and maybe we need to stretch that out a little bit further, given events taking place out there. And he also was a strong advocate for increased cooperation with America's allies across the Indo-Pacific. Now, prior to serving as National Security Advisor, he was Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs with the personal rank of Ambassador. Previously served as co-chairman of the U.S. State Department's Public-Private Partnership for Justice Reform in Afghanistan, and served with both Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. And in 2005, he was nominated and unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve as the U.S. representative to the 60th session of the UN General Assembly. He is partner emeritus. I've never met a partner emeritus at Larson LLP in Los Angeles, which is a nationally recognized litigation boutique that he co-founded in 2016. And he has served over his career as counsel and arbitrator in dozens of international proceedings. Great background for a National Security Advisor and for work that he's done. He's been recipient of the National Security Medal, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and the National Defense Medal and Kosovo Presidential Medals of Merit. What I thought we would do with our distinguished guest is to have him first talk to us about where he sees the future for 5G. And I believe you've got a prepared statement you wanted to go over and have a discussion with. So great. I'm happy to turn over the podium to you and to turn you loose.
Well, thank you, Arthur. Subject. And that's one of those introductions that no one will believe, but other than your mother. But thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for the Hudson Institute for having me today. It's Hudson continues to be at the forefront of promoting American leadership around the world, and and thinking about the future in unconventional ways to make sure that America stays ahead. So it's great to be with you today. I'd like to start my remarks by offering my sincerest condolences on the passing of Hudson's North Star, Chairman Emeritus Wally Stern. And Wally's accomplishments while guiding the Institute through the administrations of 10 U.S. presidents is truly remarkable. And he's left a legacy for Hudson and for the country. And my thoughts and prayers are with his wife, Betsy, and the rest of his family and friends, and all of you who know what an impact he made during his life and what a difference he made. So before we start talking about 5G, let me just say a couple of words about Ukraine. First, the bravery and esprit de corps and the courage of the Ukrainian people is inspiring, and it's wonderful to behold, and they are and will remain in our prayers. Second, I've always believed, and this is something Arthur's written about in his books, and we'll talk about him in a minute. I'll kind of embarrass him a bit, but great men and women matter in history, and we, social scientists today and historians like to focus on these bigger issues of demography and geography and ideology and class issues and economies, and those are all important, but great men and women can make a difference. And we're seeing that today with President Zelensky. We're watching, he's been Churchillian to date in this crisis, and we're watching a legend, and we appreciate his work and his sacrifices for the cause of freedom. Third, I think we have to take President Putin to his word. He said he was going to invade Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine. He said he was going to invade Georgia. He invaded Georgia. We knew this when I was in office, and we took him very seriously, and we did everything we could to deter him. He's now talking about invading the the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, but he's also throwing Finland and Sweden into the mix. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinarily dangerous time, and that's why Larry Kudlow, the great economist and former director of the NEC in the Trump administration, has been advocating, and I've been advocating, that we entirely cut off Russia. These half-measure sanctions are not enough. Boris Johnson agreed today and came out, and the Prime Minister said that we've got to fully detach Russia from the SWIFT system, and we have to have full sanctions on the central bank. I mean, the only thing Russia sells is oil and gas, so to sanction them but then exempt oil and gas sales is not a sanction. President Putin's making more money every dollar, and the Ayatollahs are, by the way. For every dollar that a barrel of oil goes up, they're making far more money than they're losing in sanctions. So we're neither punishing nor deterring Putin or the Ayatollahs or sending much of a message. So again, I applaud Prime Minister Boris Johnson for his calling for a total ban on SWIFT for Russia. The U.S. should endorse this proposal immediately, and especially as Ukraine is now being shelled with cluster munitions and other heavy artillery into civilian areas. Finally, it's important for our European allies to awake to the threat, and I think they are. So hopefully they'll also see China's menacing of Taiwan in the same light as they're now seeing the invasion of Ukraine. Taiwan and China are the obverse side of the Russian coin. So far, Prime Minister Johnson and President Macron have been solid in this crisis. Now, I've been, to use a diplomatic term, very candid about our German allies over the past, past couple of years, but especially over the past month, and advocating that they step up and take a leadership role as the most powerful country in Europe. And so I welcome Chancellor Scholz's new commitments to NATO and Ukraine. We need Germany back in the fold. It looks like they're taking steps in that direction, and I welcome it, and I applaud Germany for the steps it's taking now, but we need to make sure that those steps are followed through on. So those are kind of initial comments, and Arthur, you and I can talk a little bit more about it when we chat. Let me turn to today's topic of discussion, which is tech and 5G. But before doing so, I just want to comment on something. Scooter knows this. Some of you who've worked in the government know this. That there's nothing like the White House operator. They can track anyone down. And so I was lucky enough. I've been reading Arthur's books for a long time, and I wanted to talk to him about something, especially about the Navy. And he'd written a great book on the Royal Navy and the history of the Royal Navy and how Britain ruled the world with ruled the seas with the Navy. And so I just had the White House operator call him. And it's amazing when you're the National Security Advisor, people pick up the phone and they talk to you. And so Alex Gray, my former chief of staff, and I convinced Arthur to come down and meet with us. And we met with him and convinced him to come work with us. And And he proved critical during the pandemic because he wrote a book called Freedom's Forge, and talking about how we geared up in World War II, how we turned American consumer manufacturing into military production. And those are some of the things and some of the principles that we used in undertaking Project Warp Speed and building ventilators and PPE and the vaccine. So Arthur, thank you for your service in the administration, and thank you for your great advice to me while I was in office. It was very welcome then, and I know people, even if they don't admit it, they're reading your work now, the folks who are currently in office. So how do we win the telecommunications revolution and maintain our economic and technological edge in this new age of 5G? As we acknowledge an era of great power competition between the United States and China, we must renew our focus on maintaining U.S. technological and global leadership and support continued innovation in this country. America's ability to compete in the global economy depends on our technology leadership and innovation, and this is a core belief I held, and it guided my term and my time in office as National Security Advisor. The growth of wireless connectivity has produced real economic gains beyond, I think, anything any of us could have imagined even 10 years ago, and far beyond just the telecommunications sector. So today in America, the wireless industry supports 4.7 million jobs and contributes nearly $500 billion to our economy. Analysts are forecasting that with increased 5G deployment, we'll add an additional 3.8 million jobs and $1.4 trillion to the GDP over the next decade. And these are remarkable numbers. Although with the money we're spending on post-COVID, they may not sound as remarkable as they were even a year ago. While 5G communications is a technological advancement in its own right, the true potential is found in its ability to enable the applications and other innovations that will drive our economy. From agriculture to manufacturing, U.S. industry stands to benefit from vastly increased data speeds, critically improved latency, and expanded bandwidth afforded by 5G. The Internet of Things, or as you hear about or read about in the paper, the IoT, will dramatically enhance critical infrastructure sectors. And then there can be the unforeseen developments that we're not focusing on now, like medical patients being diagnosed and treated, especially with telemedicine. We're going to re-envision capabilities for smart cities, for power grid modernization. That was something that concerned me greatly, especially with the attacks and the potential for attacks on our power grid. 5G is going to do some amazing things there. We're going to have advanced transportation projects that become much more affordable with 5G. And so the ability to leverage real-time data coupled with artificial intelligence, AI, the future is almost limitless for innovation. And that's good for the United States of America because there's nothing we do better than innovate. But 5G does not come without its own security issues. Global networks and technology become a key area of competition among nations. 5G involves not just how we build and secure communications infrastructure, but how we use it to accelerate growth and innovation. And as is the case with the adoption of any new technology, early adoption of 5G will allow the U.S. to establish the normative behavior, the rules of the road, so to speak, across the spectrum, repurposing, regulations, supply chains, and broader cyber strategies. Now, how the U.S. approaches access to the spectrum required to operate successful 5G networks will do much to determine the outcome of the technological competition with China, and this is a competition we cannot afford to lose. And we'll talk. I'll kind of say this. We'll talk a little bit about Huawei and the fight we had with Huawei when we have our conversation, I think, Arthur. But what we can't do is allow the Chinese Communist Party to assume a position of leadership over the global tech industry. It's not only dangerous for the United States, but it's dangerous for the world. It's especially dangerous for our allies. We've seen enough from Xi Jinping and the CCP in recent years to understand that Beijing cannot be trusted to lead this critical industry. It's key that we understand the nature of this challenge. Events of the past few years have chosen that China is not communist in name only. Many have argued this for decades, but rather it's a Marxist-Leninist communist ideology that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership practice. It's truly everything for Beijing. Whereas many thought that China being transformed into a more liberal economic and political state would take place after they joined the WTO and received massive U.S. investment and transfers of technology, many of the transfers of which were illegal. It's more totalitarian now than it was even under Deng. Under the CCP's form of communism, the individual is a means to be used towards achievement of national goals and exists merely to serve the state. Chairman Xi is committed to spend $1.4 trillion by 2025 under the Made in China 2025 initiative to surpass the United States economically and to achieve global domination of high-tech industries like robotics, advanced information technology, aviation, and electric vehicles, as well as critical technologies including quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and autonomous systems. As of 2018, 9 of the top 20 global technology firms were based in China. And Beijing is aggressively subsidizing national champion firms with the goal of increasing that number. So our challenge is not just with an economic competitor as it was with Japan in the 1980s. The CCP's challenge goes to our very way of life and to our liberty. Thus, with respect to 5G, we require a national policy. We must establish a 5G architecture that recognizes the need for stable usage of spectrum across industries, expands wireless coverage to the entirety of the United States, including rural areas. And this is key. I can't tell you how many times we met with agricultural leaders and farmers and even tech folks who've relocated to flyover country and the heart of this great land. And they need 5G. They need the same internet connection that we get in San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. So we've got to take care of our rural areas. And we've got to encourage robust domestic production of key components like semiconductors. And it's only when we roll out a full 5G network here in the United States that will create the demand so that we can manufacture the hardware that goes with that 5G here in the US. Otherwise, if all the demand is in China, the hardware is going to get manufactured in China. And again, all the norms that go with that hardware are going to be imposed by Beijing, not by Washington. So the U.S. cannot afford to idly wait by and watch as other nations shape international policy on telecommunications policy and technology. Beijing has proven time and again their willingness to leverage tech production capabilities for economic and strategic advantage. We know from Made in China 2025 what the CCP intends to do. Yet here at home, we're at an impasse with one of the principal issues holding back U.S. dominance in this emerging field. We're immersed in a policy debate on the issue of spectrum and which band is best suited for 5G networks. The answer is not singular. Rather, the greatest benefit to innovation comes from a diverse mix of spectrum across high, low, and even mid-band. And while leading innovators understand the benefits to diverse spectrum allocation, there exists a divergent group that has expressed concern about interference with legacy systems such as GPS. The FCC recognized the need to provide room for innovation while protecting legacy systems. We've got to balance both. And to its credit, the FCC has taken steps to provide the U.S. wireless industry with high and mid-band spectrum and has determined that the regulated use of existing low-band spectrum would not infringe on and interfere with legacy systems, and that's critical because it's that low band that's going to cover the rural areas, it's going to cover the heartland of the country. The high and mid-band are great for cities, but we need that low band for the rest of the country. Excuse me, the FCC has thus set the table for the U.S. to integrate a diverse range of spectrum to meet the needs of our economy, drive innovation, and play an integral role in how the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU in Geneva, approaches 5G. In addition to setting the regulatory tone, early adoption also drives hardware and software applications, as I mentioned earlier, in these emerging technologies. And this represents another very important concern for U.S. national security. There's ample evidence to suggest that no Chinese company is independent from the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China. Huawei is just one example that has garnered attention, but there are many others. China's public subsidization of its tech industry, as well as its sweeping national security laws and legislation, has enabled Chinese companies to undercut the market competition by default and become the dominant vendor for telecommunications equipment and software around the world. And while at the same time, it gives access to the Chinese government of all of the data harvested by both the hardware and the apps around the world. Now, let me just digress for a moment here from my prepared text. We saw the danger, for example, of TikTok, which is just one of many apps. In fact, what's interesting is the Russians see the danger, and this is with their best friend China. they're telling their soldiers in Ukraine to stop using TikTok because the Chinese are harvesting their data. If the Russians won't let their folks use TikTok, we shouldn't be letting our folks use TikTok. And for those of you with younger kids or grandkids, you know how pervasive TikTok is. We banned TikTok with an executive order. Unfortunately, it was rolled back. India, on the other hand, another great democracy, the biggest democracy, and certainly an Anglosphere country, a friend of ours, after their soldiers were attacked on the line of actual control, they banned 239 Chinese apps, including WeChat, Baidu, Alibaba, TikTok, and others, to protect their people from the data that was being harvested on the Indian people, but especially their government officials and their soldiers by the Chinese. So these circumstances open the door to a potentially nefarious behavior that is nearly impossible to discover and jeopardizes our national security and puts critical supply chains at risk while simultaneously undermining U.S. economic competitiveness. In the U.S., China is already exploiting its economic and tech leverage over U.S. society, from media and entertainment to sports teams to individual Americans. I mean, we've seen where I think everyone here is probably looking forward to Top Gun 2 coming out, but Maverick's bomber jacket is not going to have Taiwan or Japan, the patches on the back of his jacket. That's the sort of market influence that the Chinese have. When the general manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted out in support of protesters in Hong Kong, democracy protesters, the NBA scrambled to kowtow to the PRC. So this concern about China's tech capabilities is expanded well beyond them stealing our IP or even stealing our personal data or information from websites and devices or dealing with our critical military systems and getting into them. It really goes to our very way of life, to the core things that we believe in the First Amendment of freedom of speech, association, and religion. So telecommunications sabotage can be very subtle, and with a Chinese stranglehold on hardware manufacturing, there's an inherent threat to open and free societies. Telecommunications systems can be specifically designed to be wiretapped, and it would be very hard to detect a well-designed backdoor in equipment. A single microscopic difference, the addition of a small chip, or the possibility of a vendor pushing a malicious update, and all security precautions that we've taken can be wiped away. Recognizing the threat posed by the CCP, the FCC has designated 5 Chinese tech firms as posing an unacceptable risk to U.S. national security: Huawei, ZTE, Hytera Communications, Hangzhou Digital Technology, and Dahao Technology. The FCC has established a rule banning the use of taxpayer dollars for the purchase of equipment or services from such companies. They pose a national security threat to the integrity of the American communications networks or their communications supply chain. Congress and the President appropriately responded with the Secure Equipment Act of 2021, which enshrined the FCC's rule in law. For 2 decades now, the U.S. has been quietly relinquishing its role as a global leader in tech hardware and allowing manufacturing to shift overseas. We're starting to correct that now in some areas, especially in semiconductors, where allied and U.S. manufacturers have announced massive reshoring efforts. One noteworthy example in the area of semiconductor production, as we've seen, is Intel's plant in which they'll invest $100 billion over 10 years to build a new semiconductor facility in Columbus, Ohio. We've also got Samsung, I think, going to Texas, and TSMC going to Arizona. So this important trend should continue. However, American innovation has been the victim for years of our passivity, and it's now more critical than ever that our creativity and instinctive leadership be based here in the United States with factories and foundries in America. Over the past 4 years, we have acknowledged the threats and the risks that have been brushed aside. And that's something I'm most proud of in the Trump administration. I think we established a new consensus, which I dare say now is hard to believe, a bipartisan consensus in America. There are very few things that are bipartisan, but I think we've developed that consensus here in America, that the threat to our economy and our national security from having our entire supply chain located in China or other countries that aren't necessarily friendly to the United States is a clear and present danger to us. So the time is now for us to write the next chapter in wireless evolution. The U.S. private sector is poised to lead the way with access to a diverse array of spectrum. Concerns surrounding spectrum interference have been addressed, and we must move forward across all 3 bands. And we must thwart the CCP from taking up the torch of innovation and leaving our nation our national security weakened. Further, our economic stability will be entirely disrupted if China's desire to displace the United States order is realized. We cannot afford to lose this race. Now, I spoke to CPAC on Saturday, as some of you may have saw, and I sounded an optimistic note on this very issue. I said we must rebuild our industrial base so that we are never again dependent on China. And that means staying ahead in technology, especially advanced semiconductor chips, space, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and quantum computing. And we have Silicon Valley and Elon down in Texas and our allies in Tel Aviv, so we'll win. But the Chinese are pumping billions into these sectors, and so we can't be complacent. And moments later, Elon Musk made me look very prescient when he tweeted the following. Starlink service is now active in Ukraine, more terminals en route. And if you've been on Twitter, you saw that the terminals arrived last night. The American private sector is stepping in to keep Russia from shutting down Ukraine's internet, and it was brilliant of Elon. And by the way, he did the same thing in a natural disaster with Tonga when they lost internet connection, and Starlink came to the rescue. So we face great challenges today, but I'm confident that America, our citizens, and our private sector, derived from our great free market, will rise to meet them, especially when it comes to the technology race. So thank you for having me. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Very much.
Oh, that's great.
I'll tell you what, I think we're going to pose some questions for a discussion about Ukraine first.
Great.
The first one I wanted to raise with you has to do with this issue about sanctions. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think most people realize that where we are now with sanctions is just too little. And it's half measures when we need full measures, particularly with regard to Russian oil and gas companies and oil and gas exports. However, to what degree can we say that part of what has limited our options with regard to sanctions, particularly in the energy sector, has been our own energy policy as a nation? I mean, I remember during the Trump administration, we were really looking forward to the day when the U.S. would become a major liquid natural gas exporter, including to Europe, with terminals set up here in the United States for export, with terminals in the Baltics and elsewhere for distribution of those exports. The way in which we have squandered our advantage as the world's #1 oil and gas producer, and the kind of leverage that we would enjoy there. And to what extent can we really see links now more strongly than ever between what our energy policy is and what our national security interests are, where the effort at sort of Green New Deal illusions can be ways that really hamper our ability to deal with really serious immediate threats like what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, look, you're absolutely right, Arthur. And one of the things I've said, the sanctions were not a deterrent, and the sanctions are not punishing Russia right now because they're half measures. So to have been a deterrent, we needed to roll out the sanctions, or at least explain to the Russians exactly what would happen if they invaded Ukraine. We didn't do that. It was very ambiguous. Now, part of that was based on our European allies not being on board at the time. They're now on board, having seen the devastation that Putin has wrought in Ukraine, and the tragedy of a modern European country being reduced to rubble under Russian artillery fire. I mean, this is something we haven't seen since 1938. I don't think there's anyone in this room old enough to remember those days. And so I think the Europeans are getting on board, and we have to put the full force of sanctions in play. But that's one part of the puzzle. The other part is American energy policy. Yeah. And again, we enabled Putin, and we're enabling the Ayatollahs, because we went from energy independence. I think we were producing about 13.5 million barrels a day in the Trump administration. I think we're at about 11.5 million now. We need to get back to energy independence. And I spoke with one of the leading figures in the American energy industry in Houston. I'll leave him nameless because he's not really a public figure, but I called and said, hey, how do we deal with this, the rise of energy prices? Because we've got to bring the amount per barrel price down, because that's what's funding the war machine right now. It's what's funding the Iranian nuclear program, and it's funding Putin's war machine in Ukraine. And he said there are 3 things we can do. Number 1, we need the Keystone Pipeline back. And I mean, the absurdity of the Keystone Pipeline is the Canadians are just going to build the pipeline to Vancouver, and they're going to send the same oil to China, which is going to refine it in refineries, that don't have any EPA oversight, and it's going to be dirty, and it's going to go up in the atmosphere. And newsflash to our environmental friends, it's the same atmosphere. It's going to come over. It's going to cause the same damage to the world environment. Instead of shipping it down to the U.S., where we've got great refineries that are clean and that are regulated, and we've got great we've got the EPA supervising them. So, just from an environmental standpoint, you want that oil coming to the U.S., not going to China. But the other thing it will do, and by the way, I've also said this is a bipartisan issue. Call the pipeline, change the name. Say we're going to reroute it around some Indian burial grounds in Nebraska that were at issue. We're going to make it with the cleanest materials we can find. We're going to use mandate union labor on it. Do all the things that the Democrats want, and then call the pipeline the Biden Build Back Better pipeline. And what I've said is we'll support it because it's good for the country, it's good for the world. I don't care what it takes. Let's get the pipeline built. Number two, we've got it. The president should fly to Texas and tell our producers, drill. We have all kinds of ongoing fields and projects, and I think we've got about half the rigs active now that we had 10 years ago. I think there were 1,300 rigs active in Texas a few years ago. I think there's something around 600 or 700 now. We need to drill and increase production. Now, there's obviously an economic incentive for the producers not to drill as much and take advantage of these high prices, but these folks are patriots. Everyone I know in the oil industry in America is a patriot. And if the president calls on them to deploy more rigs and to drill and drill more, produce more barrels, they'll do it. And number three, we've got to tell the public and the markets that we're going to open leases again on federal land for extraction, for oil and gas. And look, no one's advocating that we put a well in Yellowstone on Old Faithful. I mean, no one wants to put one up in Yosemite. I mean, those are straw man arguments. Those are arguments back from the mid 2000s when Barack Obama would say some people would like to drill in Old Faithful, others would like to preserve our natural parks, our natural resources. This is nonsense. There's a lot of federal land. I'm from the West. Have you ever driven through Nevada or Montana or Arizona or the western states? There's a lot of land that can be drilled on in a safe, effective manner, and we can produce a lot of oil and gas. Now, all those things will take a while to come on board, right? It's going to take, but what will happen? I spoke with Larry Kudlow about this today, and our former NEC director and a great economist. The futures market will take that into account. The spot market may not take that into account, but the futures market will take it into account. And soon you'll have the futures market and the spot market will start coming together. And we can bring the price of oil just with the announcements that we're going to take these actions that may take a couple of years to achieve fruition. That alone, those announcements alone will cut into Vladimir Putin's war machine. And so I don't expect it to happen. But gosh, wouldn't it be great to have an actual bipartisan State of the Union speech tonight? Wouldn't it be great to have President Biden announce these things, none of which are going to harm the environment, all of which are going to help, traditional Democrats' constituencies and the unions, and are going to help every American consumer, right, left, or center, when they go to the pump and pay less money to fill their SUV or fill their car. And so, look, we're all for green energy. We're all for electric. But even on the electric car front, I talked to one of our auto industry leaders recently. I think we buy 12 million cars a year in America. We currently produce under 1 million electric cars. With all the big factories, the Ford factory, the big Ford gigaplant that I think is going to happen in Tennessee, the GM factories that they're building in Michigan, all the new Tesla facilities, that'll provide about 3 million electric cars. That leaves a delta of 10 million cars a year that people still have to buy and drive. Are we going to just only drive used cars and not drive fuel, internal combustion engines? No, this is a transition that's going to take many years, and it's a good transition to make. It's not a bad thing. We've got to fix our electrical grid so we can charge all those cars, but again, nothing that the president could announce on this energy front, which would cut into the Ayatollahs, it could cut into Putin, and would save our consumers money. None of those things are going to hurt the environment or postpone his green energy agenda. So, again, very long answer to your question. I'm sorry about that, Arthur. I'll be better. That's why Chuck Todd hated me on Meet the Press because he'd get one answer. But those are some of the things we could do to alleviate this situation immediately. And they're totally within our control. They don't require our European allies to get on board. They don't require the UN. They don't require the Russians to do anything. They're things we can do today.
And I'll just mention, you speak the truth. And the other one I'll mention, the other missing element in a national energy policy, which I know you, very strong advocate for as well, is the nuclear power.
Yeah.
And that is going to be, you talk about the ultimate green source of energy, it's going to be the nuclear. And the way in which we can get sort of the green lobby to come to realize that and to embrace nuclear energy as the bridge to whatever is going to happen with solar and the future and so on would be hugely important. And important in our immediate environment too, because one of the things that I would really like to see is to see Germany reverse its decision about closing its nuclear plants. We've got 3 that are slated to be shut by the end of the year. And I think it would send, again, a serious message both to Putin, but also for reversing Europe's dependence on Russian energy sources to say, you know what, we're going to keep those plants open, and maybe it's time to go revisit the other plants and see about getting them up and running again.
No, you're 100% right. We can do that here as well. And look, we have to charge all these new cars that are coming online. And the grid will not support charging 3 million, much less 13 million cars, a day. And we've got to improve our grid. And look, one of the things that gives President Macron in France a real comparative advantage geopolitically is that he's got nuclear power plants all over his country. He's not dependent on foreign oil and foreign energy. And it's one of France's sources of national power and gives him a tremendous leeway in how he conducts his foreign policy because he's not energy dependent because of his nuclear power facilities.
And a safe and clean record, too. Yeah. I mean, you just have to look at what the French, compared to the Chinese and others who are getting into the nuclear power game. But let's come back to Europe and NATO in particular for a second. One of the things that I've been very pleased with, because I've been pushing hard, is expanding NATO in response to what Putin's been doing, and particularly expanding it northward to Sweden and Finland. And in fact, even now this week, the Finnish parliament is going to have joining NATO on the table. And both the Finns and the Swedes have said, we are not going to be intimidated by Putin's threats about joining NATO. And I know that that's a really important part of what needs to be done now, and you agree. Let's think about Ukraine now. I mean,
and by the way, on Sweden,
sure,
the fact that Sweden let ASAP Rocky go makes it much more likely that they'll be admitted to NATO. So that was a case I handled when I was the hostage on.
Is that right?
But, if you don't know who ASAP Rocky is, talk to your kids or your grandkids. They'll explain it to you. But no, look, I've been calling for Sweden and Finland to join NATO for some time now.
Yep.
And there had been some reticence there. The Swedes have been moving in that direction, but now the Finns, now that they've been called part of the Russian family, I don't know what Putin was thinking when they weren't part of the family in 1939 when 1 million Russians didn't come back from Finland, but that's focused their debate, I think, in Parliament.
I think it really has.
When they were called part of Russia by Vladimir Putin, I think it did it. And by the way, them coming on board, if we could get Sweden and Finland, I think Finland started the debate last night. If Finland and Sweden join NATO, that would fundamentally strengthen NATO, especially in the Arctic. These are very capable militaries, very capable air forces, very capable intelligence services. We work closely with them, even though they're not NATO members. What Putin would get if that happened, as you point out, Arthur, he's trying to weaken NATO, and he was trying to drive a wedge through NATO with Ukraine, assuming that he could peel the Germans off and show that NATO was a paper tiger. If he ends up after this invasion, however it works out, with Sweden and Finland and a stronger NATO, and Germany spending 2% of its GDP on defense, so that we can move our troops out of Germany, let the Germans take care of Germany, and we can get our troops into Poland and into the Indo-Pacific, he's going to have a stronger NATO instead of a weaker NATO, and it's really going to be a punishment for Putin for what he did, as opposed to him obtaining a goal. His goal will be farther away from him.
Farther than ever.
And so it would be huge if that happened.
And likewise with Ukraine. I mean, it's important to remember this whole thing got started about keeping Ukraine out of NATO. Now I wonder, and here I'm curious to get your view, I wonder after this invasion that Ukraine, or whatever is left of Ukraine, whether it'll be possible to keep Ukraine out of NATO. It seems to me now they've got a rock solid case. Zelensky wants to talk about joining the EU, and that's great. It's a long process, but I can certainly see the logic of that. But it seems to me now the logic for Ukraine becoming a NATO member is more imperative than ever after this. What's your view on it?
Yeah, my view is we have to support the Ukrainian people. I mean, one thing about Ukraine, which people didn't understand, and it's very different than Afghanistan. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. I know Scooter did and others in prior administrations and in the past administration. The Afghans wanted us to fight their war for them. I remember sitting around in a meeting with a current U.S. senator and having a little shura, and he said, "What would you do if the U.S. pulled out? Would you fight the Taliban on the outskirts of Kabul?" And they said, "No, that'd be dangerous. We could be killed. We need the U.S. to be there to fight them." And that's the 100% opposite from Ukraine. When I was in Ukraine in 2014 and the invasion took place, it was shortly after the invasion, but the kids were volunteering to go to the front. It's crowdsourcing body armor, crowdsourcing money to buy their own firearms, and then go to the front. They all said, "We'll fight our own battle. We'll fight the Russians. We can take these guys. We need the equipment. If you give us the equipment, we'll do the fighting. We're not asking for Americans to come fight for us." And that's the big difference between Ukraine and some other places around the world. I mean, these guys are tough. They want to fight for themselves. We need to go back to being the arsenal of democracy. And think for a moment, the $80 billion, anywhere from $7 billion to $80 billion that was left behind of military equipment that was left behind in Afghanistan. Think if that equipment, those Scan Eagle drones, the Italian Aramaki close air support fighters, the Blackhawks. Think if all that equipment, all the Humvees, all the MRAPs, think if all that equipment was in Ukraine, what the Ukrainians could do with that equipment instead of having left it behind for the Taliban. I mean, what a disgrace. And so we need to help the Ukrainians. I think we've got to put one thing that I don't think is a good idea for any of us right now, especially with, if these reports are true of Vladimir Putin's state of mind. I don't think we need to be in direct armed conflict with Russia right now. I don't think that's helpful to America or for the world. I think the Ukrainians want to fight for themselves. I think we need to give them the tools they need to fight for themselves. And if we give them those tools, and if we sanction the Russians properly and reduce the price of oil, I think we can do a lot to help. Unfortunately, a lot of it's maybe too late now. I mean, the Russians are now looking like they're going to use Grozny tactics like they did in Chechnya to destroy and lay siege to these modern European cities in Ukraine. It's heartbreaking, but I'm not advocating that we go to war with Russia, but I do think we should supply the Ukrainians with the defensive weapons, the Stingers, the Javelins, the ammunition that they need to fight their battle against Russia.
Well, they certainly seem eager, and they seem very skilled at it too, and that's another important.
Well, they're fighting for their homes.
Yep. We should probably talk about 5G.
Yeah.
And actually, and the truth is, talking about Sweden and Finland actually provides a nice bridge, especially for someone who's the author of a book about the Nordic countries, The Viking Heart, my most recent book. But we also think about Sweden and Finland.
That was a very skillful plug in there, and it's a great book, by the way. I endorse it.
I appreciate it. No, it was just a natural
Yeah.
train of thought,
Yeah.
is all that was going on there. We've got that in terms of 5G, you've got two great companies, Nokia and Ericsson, who also understand the threat that Huawei is. They're fierce competitors, but it's economies of scale that they face. And it would be interesting, in my mind, to see the U.S. companies and Nokia and Ericsson joining forces in a kind of united front against what Huawei has been doing and what Huawei's and China's ambitions are. But even apart from that possibility, when we think about what does the U.S. need to do in order to maintain its leadership and to win this 5G race, we wrote this column together back in December, pointing to, the importance of things like spectrum, things like the manufacturing base that's needed, and being able to integrate innovation. Has anything really changed in the 5G world right now? Where are we, and where do we really need to go from a legislative and from a policy standpoint, from your point of view?
That's a great question, Arthur. And I think when we think of Ericsson, Nokia, I used to jokingly say when I was National Security Advisor, we didn't have an American champion company that was making the hardware. So I was out. We'd go to countries, and we were in a massive war, literally country by country war, to stop Huawei from taking over the world's 5G internet backbone or 5G backbone. And folks would say, well, what do you recommend? And I said, Ericsson and Nokia. And I think I was the best unpaid spokesperson. I thought for sure when I left office, they'd offer me board memberships and free phones and all that sort of thing. Not that I would take it, but it was, all I did was talk about Nokia and Ericsson. So I don't think those guys realized how much I was pushing their products. Yeah. And get a flip phone, it's great. But when I took office, one of the very first, maybe the first week I was in office, we had a group of folks come in and they said, look, we can't win. Huawei's won. We can't win. Huawei's got the 5G networks around the world. They're cheap. They're being subsidized. They're going to dump. They'll undercut Nokia and Ericsson and Qualcomm, any American manufacturer that tries to get involved. It's really a lost cause. What we need to do is focus on quantum computing so that we can encrypt the data so that the Chinese can't steal it when it goes up and down to the cloud. But if they control the 5G backbone, everything that goes up and everything that goes down will go through Huawei. And they'll have access to every bit of data, military, civilian, economic, national security related. It's a disaster. And I said, look, that doesn't sound like we're a ways off from quantum. It's critical. We got to put a lot of money and a lot of research into quantum. We got to go win this fight. And I took it to the president, and we started making phone calls. And I remember it started with the Italians, with the Brits, with our Five Eyes partners. New Zealand and Canada were a little bit reticent, but we started using all the tools, economic tools the United States had. We started using, visa-free travel with some countries. And we said, look, this is a national security issue for us. If you put Huawei in, we may not be able to share, this is something we talked to the Brits about. We may not be able to share intelligence with you. All of a sudden they're saying, you got to be kidding me. It's like, yeah, we're not sharing intelligence that's going to go up and down, on the Huawei network. And I said, what we do share with you will be typed up. It'll be put in a locked carry bag, and we'll send a courier, on a plane, and we'll bring it to you. So there's not going to be a lot, but we'll bring you some stuff in a lock bag, and then you'll look at it and you'll give it back to us, and we'll take it back with us. And our allies realized we were serious. And I said, we'll have a courier service. It'll go back and forth every day or two, and we'll figure out how to get you as much as we can, but it's not going to be what we've got now. And when countries realized we were serious, and they realized that we were serious on the economic front, we started peeling countries away. And we peeled away, we developed a great coalition of Australia, Japan, eventually the UK after after having to argue a little bit with...
some false starts.
I got yelled at more than once by Prime Minister Johnson, who I have the highest respect for and as a friend. But we had some tough times, but we got to where we needed to be with our allies. And then we started getting other countries like Brazil and using the Exim Bank, which again is a kind of a free market conservative. You hate using the Exim Bank or Development Finance Corp and those sorts of tools, but those are the tools we need to compete against the Chinese around the world, so that we can allow countries that don't want to be part of the Chinese 5G empire, but want to be have a trusted provider, whether it's Nokia or Ericsson or Rakuten in Japan or now there's some interesting Microsoft and Dell and U.S. options for 5G. If they want to be part of a trusted network and don't want to be part of China and the Chinese Communist Party's network, there are options, and we've got with XM and with DFC, we've got some ways to finance the purchases of the hardware that they need to put those 5G systems together. But it wasn't easy. Even with the XM, there were some provisions on what could be financed, and if it wasn't, I think 51% or at one point 90% American made, it couldn't be financed by XM. So that cut out Nokia and Ericsson. So we had to work on the regulations and some rules and that sort of thing to make sure that we could get trusted providers into our allies so that they could have a 5G network that wasn't dominated by China. And one of the things that will happen is as we open the 5G spectrum here, and we have a truly national 5G network, because we're not there yet, where there's a lot of advertising for 5G, but to get a true 5G network, there's going to be a lot of demand for 5G products, and you're going to have American manufacturers putting together 5G solutions and building them here in America. That'll spur the demand for the manufacturing. That'll bring jobs back and factories back.
I think so. And also from as many different companies and hands as possible.
Absolutely.
And come to realize that 5G is one of those technologies that can actually be decentralized and gain in terms of economies of scale as well as efficiency and productivity. No, with my time at the National Security Council, I watched this happen, this pushback against Huawei, and it was just amazing to watch because, again, like you were saying, the defeatists and the pessimists were saying Huawei's one. They've got 90 plus countries already signed up. What people didn't realize is that they had them signed up,
Right.
memorandums of understanding and contracts, but the actual building and the actual construction of those 5G networks was off in the future. So there was an opportunity to get in there and to make people rethink their deals with Huawei and what was set up.
Well, we had a great team. You were involved in that, and Keith Kroc, who's now set up the Center for Technology and Diplomacy at Purdue, was heavily involved. Mike Pompeo was involved.
Yes, he was.
And we brought in the president. I mean, the president would make these calls to foreign leaders on 5G, and he wasn't quite sure at the beginning. I'm not sure he was a believer that we could win it, but once we started flipping countries, and he loved it. He loved making those calls, and making deals, and checking off his list, and he was a very persuasive salesman on this as well. So we really had a great team effort between Mike and Keith and you helping us over at the NSC and the president.
And the export people too, Exim Bank.
Kim Reed
great.
at Exim Bank and Adam Bowler at DFC.
Yep.
I mean, we really had a terrific team that fanned out across the world to sell as much Nokia and Ericsson equipment as we could.
And I think also too, it was possible to make it clear just who you were dealing with when you were dealing with Huawei. That just wasn't just another Chinese telecommunications company. That Huawei played dirty. That they used. I could tell you stories from engineers from Nokia, from Cisco, about just how dirty they could play, including the use of intimidation of physical force. I was having these series of columns that I was writing for Forbes on Huawei and on the battle for 5G, and Huawei tried to shut me down. I mean, they threatened a lawsuit to Forbes, claiming that my columns were libelous and tried to get me silenced in the process. Forbes, God bless them, didn't let it happen.
Good for them.
But it was a sign of just how much Huawei understood in that 2019, 2020, they understood just how critical winning the public relations battle in America was going to be to their success elsewhere. And if they couldn't get the U.S. government to basically take a hands-off approach with regard to what Huawei was doing and where they were going, if they could get them to take that, they would win. But if the U.S. government became involved, went to our allies and said, you cannot allow this to happen. We cannot let Huawei and China dominate the future of access to data through the 21st century. That once you had an administration that took that on, as the Trump administration did, and with your leadership and with Mike Pompeo and everybody who was on board with this, once that happened, it became possible to see a different outcome.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that you mentioned with the threatened lawsuit, what's really sad is that it's unbelievable how much these Chinese companies, and these are, if they're not state-owned enterprises, they're basically instrumentalities of the Chinese. They pay a lot of money in Washington for big-time lobbyists, former administration officials, law firms, and it's amazing. Just like Wall Street and just like Hollywood, there's a fair number of people on K Street at law firms and people that we all know that are willing to take Chinese money. I used to say this every time we took a tough action against China, the White House switchboard would light up, and it was lit up with millionaires and billionaires calling from Wall Street, trying to get through to lobby for the Chinese. And the Chinese have built a lot of houses in the Hamptons, a lot of houses in Florida, Palm, and other places, and it's heartbreaking. A lot of houses in Bel Air with the Hollywood folks, and a lot of houses probably in McLean and the nice neighborhood in Georgetown here that people are making money from the Chinese to the detriment of the United States of America, and that's heartbreaking for me, especially knowing some of the people involved, because it's really a shame.
Yeah, the lawsuit that was threatened against me came from American law firm.
Yeah,
no doubt about it. And I was thinking, how do you guys live with yourselves? But I didn't have the discussion with them about philosophical discussion about those kinds of issues.
When you're at the house at the shore, maybe it makes it a little easier.
It's probably true.
It's too bad.
There's one other aspect of this, the 5G, and then maybe what we can do is open up the discussion. What do you think?
Be great.
In addition to where you see where we are now in terms of 5G policy with this administration, with Congress, right, and We're thinking that there will be a shift of power in Congress coming in November, both in the House and also in the Senate. Where you see 5G policy going, being realistically in terms of helping to accelerate both the growth of 5G networks in the country, but also the pushback against Huawei's bid for global hegemony. And then also to talk about the role of manufacturing. Talk about manufacturing with semiconductors, the importance of reshoring. It's one of the things that we've been doing at the Hamilton Commission. It's been working on that here at Hudson. But it's also, I think, we can't forget, it's also, and it will be an important factor towards America's 5G industry going forward. But let me throw you the first question first about where you see policy going.
Yeah, look, I think certainly the House, I think, is going to go over to the GOP, probably in a pretty big number. Greg Smith, the former Deputy Director of Political at the White House, is here. And I'd say, Greg, what do you think? 20 to 30 seats probably right now is what it's looking like. It could be higher. I mean, the polls are so bad for the Dems, it could be 40 to 60, but I think probably 20 to 30 is most likely. But again, we've got a long time in politics. We're still 8 months away from the election, so it's a ways off. Anything can happen. But I think the Republicans take the House. I think they probably take the Senate. The Senate map was good for the Democrats, and the retirements were good for the Democrats. But I think the GOP probably takes the Senate back as well by one or two seats. I'm going to say something here that is not going to be popular among conservatives. The Biden administration has kept in place a number of the Trump policies on China, and they've been, and I think they're pretty good on 5G and a number of these things. The problem with the Biden administration is it's very process driven. It's very slow. We have a lot of academics there. They're very smart men and women, but it's like the faculty lounge. Everything is just debated and perseverate over the things, and they're trying to get the perfect white paper. And sometimes in international affairs, as we've seen, they move quickly, especially when you've got decisive adversaries. They move fast, and we've got to move fast. And one of the things that I'm hoping with a GOP-controlled Congress is it will push some of these things, some of these initiatives, whether it's 5G or tech or the CHIPS Act, and we can do it without all the nonsense legislation. I mean, there was a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate that was pretty good on chips. And then it went to the House, and Nancy Pelosi put the entire Build Back Better initiative into it, and then gave $7 billion to the Chinese, and as part of the bill. I mean, it was supposed to be the anti-China bill, and we're actually going to subsidize Chinese companies as part of it. So it didn't make any sense, and it lost all bipartisan appeal at that point. Whereas the Senate bill had, I think, 17 or 18 Republican votes. It was a pretty bipartisan bill these days. That could have gone through, and that would have been helpful on all these issues that we've been talking about today. I think with a GOP Congress, and with the inclination of some of the folks like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Kurt Campbell over at the White House that are somewhat inclined to these to do some of these things in Asia, I think the legislation could push them in the right direction and maybe speed things up, speed the process up, and get us some positive results. And look, I think President Biden might actually like having a Republican Congress. They never admit it, but right now he's being held hostage by Nancy Pelosi and the squad and his far left folks, and that's why we've got such bad energy policy. It's why we've got such bad policy on the border. I think with a Republican Congress, he might be much more inclined to try and work out some deals, and it might be half a loaf for us, but it's not zero. And so
that's more his
hopeful.
normal ground in the Senate, was
that's what you
doing
think.
stuff like that.
That's the old Scranton Joe, as opposed to the squad kind of pushing the agenda for the Democrats these days. So look, it's really important for the country that the GOP take back both the House and the Senate, because then we'll have an opportunity to maybe get some of these policies that they might be inclined to agree with, but get them done and get them rolled out.
Yep, I agree. And the other thing I'm going to say before we open up too, when we talk about the importance of innovation in American technology, which is hugely important, but one of the things that I've been stressing in my writings and the work that I'm doing, and that I think was really understood by the Trump administration and thinking about technology as a whole, is that innovation by itself really doesn't get you very far. You can have lots of bright ideas and great research projects and lab experiments and foundations and companies paying for it. R&D is hugely important. But there's another side, and that's productivity. And if you don't have innovative ideas with technology linked to and connected to productivity and the ways in which to make products and to deliver products faster and cheaper and more efficiently, If you don't have that, then you are going to lose the technological race, which is why, in terms of the work that we do in the advanced technology and with manufacturing have to merge. We have to think about them as a whole. The problem has been with the Silicon Valley mentality, everything is thought of as being, software based. It's all conceptually driven, and you create a few apps and you're off and running, and you cash in your chips and you're a retired billionaire looking for a second career at age 35. But the truth is that to really make an impact, and where our history as a leadership in technology and in industry is, it has to be linked to actually producing things. The hardware and the software have to be thought about as forming a whole as far as our economic destiny.
Well, that's
goes
where you see
forward.
Elon Musk. I mean, it's kind of like Iron Man, these days. I mean, the Russians threatened to take down the ISS. He says, "Don't worry, I'll send Starship up to save it." I mean, the Russians take down the internet in Ukraine. He sends Starlink over to get it. I mean, but he's combined manufacturing and both the IP and the manufacturing with Tesla and SpaceX. And look, you're seeing all that also with Peter Thiel and the companies he started with, Palantir and now Anduril, the defense company, which is really a disruptive defense company that's manufacturing here in America. And so,
great company.
So you're seeing it. You are seeing some of that. Not nowhere near enough of it, but we're seeing some of that here.
And we're going to see that in the quantum sector too, eventually. I mean, we haven't talked very much about that, and don't get me started talking about quantum security and how important that will be. Post-quantum
I'm not smart enough to talk
cryptography and
about
others.
quantum. My last science class was chemistry at Cardinal Newman High School, so it's.
It's not so complicated. Just open yourself up to the fact that it's an entirely irrational and random science, but that it has strong and important security roots for us, particularly quantum security and for 5G. But there too is an area in which we can't just think about it in terms as a science or even as a technology, but also as a future industry and what happens from there. Should we open up to questions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Arthur.
If you could also just identify yourself and whatever affiliations you care to disclose in the process, that would be helpful for our audience at home.
Great, Scooter Levy, and the Hudson Institute acknowledges me as affiliated with it. I have questions for you on Ukraine and Iran, but I can't think of a way to pretend that they're related to 5G. So let me ask you a China question where I can pretend that it's related. Back during the Trump administration, and I believe since, the U.S. government has firmly asserted that China has stolen, I think Director Radcliffe's number was $500 billion a year worth of intellectual property. What have we done, or what could we do to actually hold responsible the government, which, as you point out, virtually every major company in China is under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party? So what can we do? Because if we can't, then all this innovation and the failure to reach productivity that Arthur was referring to will be undercut.
No, so that's a great question, Scooter. And Scooter and I served together in the Bush administration. I was much more junior than Scooter was in those days. But it's a terrific question. Christopher Wray, in his speech on China, we did a series of 4 speeches in the summer of 2020. Myself, Pompeo, Bill Barr, and Chris Wray. And the idea was that series of speeches was to be the equivalent of the long cable, of Kennan's long cable at the end of the 40s on the Cold War. Chris talked about IP theft, and what he said is in a speech, and it was really remarkable if you think about it, that the IP theft from the United States by China is the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And as soon as he said that, I kind of thought I had this vision of Trajan's column and Rome of all the Dacian loot being brought back by the Roman legions and to the treasury at the Forum. And I thought someone's got to do a column, to Xi showing, with computers on it, instead of the oxen and the chariots, with computers or something, that all the wealth that he brought from the United States to China, and it's astounding. I mean, it's really unbelievable what we did. And look, we turned a blind eye to it for 30, 40 years. And the reason we turned a blind eye is we had this very naive assumption that the richer the Chinese got as their middle class grew, that they would become more like us, that they'd become a liberal democracy, that they'd become open economically, that they'd allow us to compete in China for the big Chinese market. And I still remember from a young lawyer and was doing some franchise law where, when one executive said, look, the very Chinese person bought like one hamburger from us. There'd be a billion some hamburgers. I mean, this was the idea we had. I didn't realize that what they do is they'd steal everything that came over. Especially if you built a business in China, it pretty quickly became a Chinese business, and they gave you an offer you couldn't refuse. And so there's got to be a way to get compensation for that and to deter the Chinese. One of the things that we looked at in the Trump administration were the increased tariffs. And there was some thought, and folks like Peter Navarro argued for 100% tariff on Chinese goods and shutting them out of the market. It doesn't compensate the businesses that have been lost. It doesn't compensate for the money that's been lost. But it will produce money because the Chinese will still, they'll just use their slave labor or whatever they do to still sell here and absorb the tariff prices. But it'll give American manufacturers and American companies an opportunity to compete. And so that's one approach. Like I've heard people suggest approaches like the UNCC, which was the commission that decided claims against Iraq arising out of the Gulf War. And people have talked about that with the pandemic as well. So it's not just the trillions of dollars that they've stolen in IP. Think about what they've cost in lives and in property with this Wuhan virus, with COVID. That there's no doubt in my mind that it came from the lab, and that it was covered up. And it was that cover-up, it was that months of cover-up and that refusal to cooperate with the WHO, other than the sham WHO investigation, the refusal to cooperate with our CDC, that delayed us for months from getting our arms around the COVID crisis, of getting the ventilators. And although the ventilators turned out not to be great treatment, but we thought early on they would be, but we didn't build the ventilators, we didn't manufacture the PPE, we didn't do the things that we needed to do to be ready for that crisis because the Chinese covered it up. I think the cover-up in history is going to be viewed worse than Chernobyl as a cover-up by a Communist Party.
By far and away.
And so there ought to be a way to compensate not just the United States, but the world for those losses that came from China. And here's the thing, it's not like this is the first time this has happened. There's a massive public health crisis in China. We had SARS come from China. We had avian flu come from China. We probably had MERS, even though it's Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, probably came from China. COVID came from China. There's been 5 or 6 major health pandemics in the last 25 years that have come from China. And all the focus on whether it came from a wet market or the lab in some ways misses the point. I mean, neither answer is good, right? All these diseases came because we've got filthy wet markets that sell exotic animals that people consume live on site, or it came out of one of our military labs. I mean, either answer is a bad answer for the Chinese. They need to get their arms around it because they keep getting the world sick, and we can't get sick from them any longer. And one of the ways, obviously the carrots, we've given them a lot of carrots. The carrots haven't helped. They've taken all the carrots, they've eaten them, we've got nothing in return. Maybe it's time for sticks, and one of the sticks might be some way to figure out how to get compensation or how to bar the Chinese from doing business here, unless they're going to play by the rules, unless they're going to cooperate in public health, unless they're going to stop the IP theft, unless they're going to stop the synthetic, heroin and opioids and drugs that are coming into this country, from China. So those are all things that they need to be cooperating with us on, and if they don't cooperate with us, there's really no reason to do business with them. I mean, there's no reason to have 100,000 Chinese students a year in our universities, getting our know-how to take back to Beijing, to steal our technology. Look, I want good relations with the Chinese people. I mean, the Chinese people are terrific people. They're innovative, they're smart, they're hardworking as heck. They were our allies in the Second World War. I mean, Chinese Americans are amazing, the things that they've done in this country. So I've got no animus, and no one has any animus towards the Chinese people, but they're governed by this Chinese Communist Party, which is really the last Marxist-Leninist party on earth. And people say, no, North Korea. North Korea is a family dynasty. China is the last real hardcore Marxist-Leninist Communist Party in the world. And they believe, and they want to dominate the world. They've said that. They believe that they're it's a combination of Chinese Middle Kingdom, philosophy and Marxist-Leninism. And it just doesn't work for our way of life.
No,
and we've got to do everything we can to oppose it.
Or for many others. I'm going to make a quick observation and then a quick story in response to Scooter's question. I think, and I've looked at this, there's 2 ways to think about IP theft. One of it is the actual theft, stealing, hacking, etc. And by the way, that is where the quantum, post-quantum cryptography and quantum cryptography, creating hack-proof networks and encryption, which is totally safe, not just current hacking, but also future hacking by China. But there's another subtle kind of IP theft, which is the one that American companies allowing China to acquire intellectual property through technology transfers, through the elaborate rules about storing of data, et cetera, in China, if they're doing business in China, having to work with Chinese companies who are constantly purloining whatever they can get their hands on in terms of what we would call intellectual property. And in 2016, a Hudson colleague and I, John Lee, came up with a study that we were going to do, which was about IP theft in China. It was a study not just based on what was lost, but what China gained as a result of IP theft for the United States. How did it enable Chinese industries to move up the value chain? And we had a kind of interesting idea about an econometric model to study that. And one of the industries we targeted that we thought would be really interesting to explore was pharmaceuticals. Now, this is 2016, but really interesting. We were thinking about pharmaceuticals at that point. And we approached, I'm not telling tales out of school, we approached big pharma, the big pharma about this idea. And they were like, we would love to see that study, but don't have our fingerprints anywhere near it. Because the last thing we want to do is threaten our potential markets in China. And I think American companies have to assume responsibility and some accountability here. That they complain about IP theft, they complain about the way the Chinese take advantage and steal our lunch, but they keep putting the lunch on the table and walking away, or at least turning away. And so part of the change hasn't to be just from government, it's got to be a change in mindset in the American corporate leadership about what the real costs are going to be for them of doing business in China. I'm hoping that COVID will help to wake them up to just what those real perils are. But there's a lot still, even now, even after all the attention we've brought to the China threat, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely.
Tom Duesterberg, take that.
Hi, I'm Tom Duesterberg. I'm a senior fellow here. I wanted to return to 5G. A couple of weeks ago, Eric
Get us
Schmidt,
back on topic, that's good.
Eric Schmidt and Graham Allison wrote this article saying that we, the U.S., are woefully behind China in terms of deployment of 5G and development of the technology. You mentioned in your remarks that we ought to do what we can to have a domestic industry. We really don't have a hardware industry now, given the traditional proprietary networks. And you mentioned Nokia and Ericsson as being the leaders. My question is, what should we do to promote the development, at least partly, of a domestic industry, if not all? Should we work with the Europeans? The Japanese have been aggressive about wanting to promote a technology called Open Radio Access Network,
Right.
Open RAN. How do you balance the need to find an alternative to the Chinese and either work with our allies or go it alone?
Yeah, so I think that's a really prescient question, because standing up an industry from from scratch is going to take a couple of years, and we don't have a couple of years on this issue right now. We got to move now, and so we're going to have to. I think I'm a big proponent of onshoring, but we also have to be willing to nearshore, and we have to be able to use trusted providers where we don't have the equipment, especially if it's coming from our strong allies, whether it's Japan or granted, Finland and Sweden are neutral now, but hopefully they'll be NATO allies soon, but certainly call them partners. We have to be willing to use trusted providers. In the meantime, as the domestic industry grows around more spectrum and a real robust 5G rollout. And so, and I think we have to be humble in how we do that. We want to sell the Japanese a lot of F-35s. That's a big ticket item. It costs a lot of money. We ought to be prepared in some cases to buy some things, back from the Japanese, or back from the Italians, or back from whatever other, country can sell us things. So I don't think I'm all for buying American and having a domestic industry, but there are also things. If we've got a domestic semiconductor industry, the telecom manufacturers are going to be buying the semiconductor chips from the American companies. So although it may be a Nokia branded product, it's going to have a lot of the guts of it are going to be from American companies. So we need to kind of look at those issues and not be too hung up on the labels. What's critical is that the provider is a trusted provider and a trusted vendor, and coming from a trusted company. I think that's the most important thing. And I think the commercial relationships and the infrastructure that gets built around that will ultimately end up here domestically in the U.S. and will benefit us. But I'd trade, Japan some F-35s for some Rakuten, radio towers. We get a lot more radio towers. I mean, every F-35 at 100 and whatever we're selling, 110 million or whatever, we get a lot of radio towers for that. So.
Riley Walters, I'm with the Japan chair here at Hudson Institute, so I appreciate that. You mentioned a couple times in your speech some of the fights you had in the administration to convince other countries to throw out Chinese telecoms. I wonder if you have any lessons learned, best practices to advise now on that. And do you find any countries that maybe we should be focusing towards as we compete on the global scale toward 5G development? Thank you.
So another good question. What I think we underestimate is the draw of the United States. The countries want to partner with the United States. We make it difficult to partner with the United States oftentimes, but countries want to be part of the, I'll call it the cool kids table at the lunch, the cafeteria, and folks want to work with us if we can make it easy to work with the United States, and that's where things like XIM and DFC and other tools that we have help. But if we approach countries, if we treat them as equals, if we treat them well, if we explain to them and we're willing to show a little bit more intelligence than we might otherwise do with a country like Brazil that's not a Five Eyes or a NATO partner. I always found it that we always got an open door and a real good hearing. And if we laid out the facts and didn't try and gild them, but explained to them what the dangers were, and then gave them a solution of how they could solve it. And that was one of the problems we had with 5G is we tell countries the dangers, and they'd say, okay, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
You don't have a solution for me. So I think you got to be able to, give a country, if you're asking them to do something that's in our interest, explain the problem to them, explain the issue, explain the security threat, but then also provide a solution for them. And that might be a mix of some sort of financing or just simply point them in the right direction of the technology they should be using. Or we might have to open up something that maybe we only shared with our closest allies, but isn't absolutely essential that we keep in a small group, and we can extend it out to some trusted partners. So those are the things that I think we can do to get results. And as far as countries we need to focus on, we need to focus on India. India. One of the things I spent a lot of time on was the Quad, which is the relationship between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, and Asia as a bulwark against China. And the thing that scares the Chinese communists the most of anything we do is our diplomatic relationship with the Quad. And again, I'll compliment the Biden administration here. The first foreign head of government to visit the White House was the Japanese Prime Minister. The first virtual summit that President Biden held was with the Prime Minister of India and Prime Minister of Australia and Prime Minister of Japan. And so, building up the Quad and making sure that they're on side with 5G is really critical. I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Chinese have made, they play pretty hardball in international politics, and they've been on a run for many years, and they've had their way for many years. The mistake that they made in attacking the Indians in the Himalayas on the line of actual control and brutally slaughtering that Indian patrol was monumental. And I don't know if that was approved by Beijing or if that was a local commander trying to get the attention of his superiors and show how tough he was. But the backlash, the way that they handled the remains of the Indian soldiers was a disgrace. And what happened to those Indian soldiers was a disgrace. And when the news of that got out into the Indian popular press and the Indian people understood what the Chinese had done to them, this was not something that the Indian government could paper over in the interest of good relations with China. And they really turned public opinion in India against China. We need to be there for the Indians, and we were there for them in that crisis, by the way, and we did a lot for the Indians behind the scenes. And but we need to be there for India, because if we can pull that 1.3, 1.4 billion people into a league of, and they're democracy. We had a tight league of democracies with Japan and Australia, and then we got to get our wayward friends in New Zealand. I mean, Jacinda Ardern's a lovely person. I'm actually friends with her. I've met her on several occasions. My daughters think she's terrific, and she grew up as in my religion, and so I got I like her a lot. But New Zealand's gone very wobbly on China, and they pulled away from Australia and Japan and the U.S. on that front. And so it's a small country, but it's an important country. It's part of Five Eyes, and we need to get on New Zealand. The other country that's very wobbly on China, it's a little embarrassing, is Justin Trudeau's government, Prime Minister Trudeau's government in Canada. Very soft on China. I mean, even after the two Michaels were held hostage for over a year and treated very poorly in prison by the Chinese. So we need to get Canada and New Zealand back on side, and we need to really reach out to India. Those would be the countries I would think in our immediate, where we'd have the most opportunities for success. We could move on those right away and try and shut the Chinese out of those markets for 5G and otherwise.
Yep. If I can throw one more onto the pile for countries where I think it's not only desirable, but maybe even essential to get Huawei out and U.S. and allies out, and that's Saudi Arabia. I think if the Saudis and the Emirates, we could get them to rethink working with Huawei and working with China on their 5G networks, I think the impact could be really long-term in the Middle East. The Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia is really trying to rethink the future of his country, moving away from a totally oil and natural gas dominated economy, and really, how do I break into the modern world and become part of it? And if he, instead of turning to the West, the United States, as the model for becoming part of the modern world and diversifying his society, not just economically, but also culturally, but instead turns towards China, that's going to have, I think, it's going to be a disastrous result for the Middle East as a whole, and also for American interests in that region. That is one that I think would be an important win for the future, not just for the United States and for regard to China, but also an important win for the future of Saudi Arabia and the whole Arabian Peninsula.
No, I agree with you. And unfortunately, one of the things we've seen is a bit of a frosty relationship with both the Emirates and Saudi, the KSA, since the new administration's taken office.
I know it's a shame,
and it's too bad because we had very strong relationships with the Crown Prince of the UAE and also with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding the issues there, and we need to thaw out those relationships. Because the Chinese are very cunning and very smart and very tough when it comes to diplomacy, and they've seen that fissure, and they're looking to take advantage of it and trying to create a cleavage between us and our Gulf allies, and that would be a shame.
And I think 5G would be an opportunity to do that, to mend some fences and to get Saudis to think about the West as where the future is instead of the East. And that's another damn shame about this whole Ukraine thing.
Yeah.
And the rise in the price of oil. It's going to make Mohammed bin Salman think, I want to diversify my economy, maybe not quite yet. Anything else?
Hi, David Asher, Hudson Institute. Robert, always great to see you. Really appreciated the great job you did as National Security Advisor. We're all very proud of you. And I'm so glad you had Arthur helping you out, because that was exactly what I would do. We have beyond 5G, we're actually am slightly optimistic that we will be able to create an electronics and microelectronics industry in the U.S., especially with phased arrays and new generations of microchips, which are just hitting the market, being produced in the United States in part, and in Sweden. Taiwan, if you were a national security advisor right now and you saw what was going on in Ukraine, and knowing that you and Matt had spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about the China threat to Taiwan, what would you be doing now to try to deter China from taking action in the next 12 to 24 months against Taipei?
Good question.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for those kind comments. Look, Taiwan is of critical geopolitical importance to the United States. I like to tell people that if you think about the geography of the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan is the cork in the champagne bottle. If that cork pops out, the PLA Navy and People's Liberation Army are going to spread out all over the entire Pacific, threatening not just our allies in the region, the Pacific Islands, but down to Australia and as far as New Zealand and Antarctica in the south, cutting off those allies from our allies in the north with Japan and South Korea, but actually spilling out and threatening American possessions, Wake and Midway and Hawaii or states of Alaska, California, where I live. I mean, it's a real disaster if the free world loses Taiwan. That's from a geopolitical standpoint. But from a humanitarian standpoint, this is a thriving democracy of great people. If anyone spent much time in Taiwan, I was lucky enough to spend a few months there on a case I was handling as a special master a few years ago before I was in office, and a legal case. And they're the greatest people in the world. It's one of the places that's the closest to America in temperament and feel. And folks going out to there's a movie theaters on the corners and TGI Fridays. I mean, you feel, and combined with this great Asian culture with the night markets and that sort of thing. But there's not the rush and hustle that you get in some of the big Asian cities. People are relaxed. They've really developed a thriving democracy. I think it's Taiwan's transition from an authoritarian government to a real democracy, a thriving democracy, is. People always talk about South Africa. I think what happened in Taiwan and the way that they've sustained their democracy is the most impressive thing that we've seen in the last 50 years. That transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And there's some Chile was a similar situation. There's some backsliding there now, unfortunately. There's been some backsliding in South Africa, but Taiwan is just a great example of a democracy flourishing. And to see that extinguished for no other reason than that Xi Jinping wants to have a legacy. It's almost like this thing that's happening with Putin in Ukraine. People don't understand, Taiwan's never lived under the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has never ruled Taipei. It's been 120 years since they were even affiliated with China, but they've never lived under communism. They don't want communism. They don't want Xi Jinping running their country. They want to elect their own leaders and have a peaceful democratic country. And look at the wonderful economy that they've developed as a result of it. But that wonderful economy also is a geopolitical issue, because most of the advanced chips that we use are made by TSMC, are made in Taiwan. I mean, the last thing we want to do is lose basically it's the, in some way this is the OPEC of chips. We can't lose that. So we've got geopolitical, we've got humanitarian and kinship ties, and we've got this critical economic issue all wound up together in Taiwan. And yet we have a very aggressive China. People haven't been reporting it, but the incursions into the air defense identification zone of Taiwan over the past week and a half during this Ukraine crisis have been enormous. And so the Chinese are probing, and they want to see if they can pull off what Putin's pulled off. I think the Taiwanese would fight just as hard as the Ukrainians. But we've gone to the Taiwanese and said, there are things you need to do too. I mean, we have been advocating, it's a difficult issue, gun ownership's a difficult issue in Taiwan. I mean, it's not like, California or not like the United States where we're more of a gun culture. But we've advocated, and I advocated to the Taiwanese in office, when I was in office, you need to, everybody, every able-bodied male and maybe female now, what we're seeing with the Ukrainians, has to have an AK-47. You've got to have your adversary's weapons so you can use their ammo after you take them out. You can pick up their mags. And the Chinese have to understand that every household in every village in every city in Taiwan, there's going to be somebody with an AK-47 pointing at them if they do make it off the beaches and get into the interior. I've advocated that we give, I think we're stopping this year. We already stopped the manufacture of Stinger missiles. That's crazy. We need to manufacture Stinger missiles. They may not be effective against fifth generation aircraft. Maybe not the J-20 and some of the very highly advanced Japanese or Chinese aircraft, but they're very effective against rotary wing aircraft, even the most modern. And there are 2,700 police precincts in Taiwan. We advocated that every police precinct in Taiwan have a Stinger missile and have a police officer trained to shoot it. Now, we don't want to give those to everybody in the populace, but every police station ought to have a man pad and keep it under lock and key. And if the Chinese invade, the policemen go out and they all take down a helicopter. And all of a sudden, this massive rotary wing aircraft advantage that the Chinese have and will have to use in an amphibious invasion of Taiwan gets neutralized quickly because every single village and town and city block has a stinger that's going to be pointed at them. Sea strike, sea mines are another area that if it looks like an amphibious invasion is imminent, like we saw the buildup in Ukraine, deploy those across the strait, shut down the strait, and let the Chinese know that they're going to lose half their ships to sea mines. So there are things that the Taiwanese need to do. The Taiwanese need to start spending more than 1% on defense. They've now said they're going to move to 2%, which is kind of the gold standard, but they really ought to be at 4 or 5 or 8%, given the disparity in their economy to China's economy and given what China's spending on their defense budget. So there are things that the Chinese should do, but then on the American side, we need to let them know that you'll never spot our Virginia-class subs or our Los Angeles-class subs. You don't know how many are in the straits. You don't know what we're going to do. And we've got tactics and techniques and practices that will allow our carriers to survive your Dongfeng missile onslaughts, and we can operate in the A2 AD bubble. And we're not going to tell you how, but we can, and I can tell you we can. And we've got no one wants to go to war with China, but China needs to understand that we're going to back up Taiwan, or at least they've got to have the concern that we're going to back up Taiwan, and have that in the mind of their planners as they're thinking about an amphibious assault. So there's a lot the Taiwanese need to do themselves, and there's a lot we need to do. Ultimately, though, look, I've been writing about this for many years, well over a decade, about having a 355-ship Navy. Well, we've been talking about it for a decade. The Chinese actually built a 355-ship Navy, and it's almost at 400 ships now, and it's highly capable. A lot of the technology is stolen. A lot of their destroyers look like the British air warfare destroyers, in the Dauntless class, but they've got some capable kit, and they've built a big Navy, and we're still talking about building a Navy, and we need to get on it right away. Hypersonics were an area that it's the hypersonic threat that keeps our carriers at bay around Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, and we had a great hypersonic program. It was shut down for 8 years during the Obama administration. And the Chinese, they didn't even have to steal all the information. They got a lot of it was gray market or things that they got from universities. They took all our research and R&D on hypersonics, and they took it back to Beijing, and they developed an incredible hypersonic program, and then they built it out. And so my number one defense priority is, as National Security Advisor, was getting our hypersonic program restarted and out. And it was a battle with folks in the Pentagon. But we won the battle, and as of next year, I think the Army is going to start rolling out their hypersonic long-range fires, and the Navy should have some out as early as 2023, and the Air Force will be a little bit longer. They've got a little bit of different challenges for air-launched weapons, but they'll have theirs out in 24, 25, and we're going to have a hypersonic arsenal to deter. Not that we ever want to use it with the Chinese, but to deter the Chinese. So we're doing some things, and we just need to keep doing them. But we got to send a strong message, and part of how we handle Ukraine will send a message to Xi. If he sees a stronger NATO, if he sees Russia totally isolated and cut off from the world economy, if he sees the Russians fighting and dying in Ukraine, he's going to think twice about invading Taiwan.
We're going to have to leave it there. Ambassador Bryan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. What an honor.
Thank you.